6 years. So what are nurdles? Nurdles are small plastic pellets. They are the raw base material to anything plastic. So your computers, your car dashboards, the glasses you're wearing, those were first nurdles that were then shipped to factories that melted them down, added color, and then made them into the product that they are now. And what we're finding is these are washing up on beaches, on riverbanks, on lake shorelines, all over the U.S. Not only the U.S., but all over the world. And so in an effort to try to figure out where these are coming from, we started up this Nurdle Patrol citizen science project. And I have a diagram here on how these nurdles get out into the environment. I get a lot of questions. It's like, how are these getting out? Is it just the manufacturers that are making them? No, actually. They're based on the data that's come in already to the Nurdle Patrol project. We've seen that, at the manufacturing site, there are a lot of plastic pellets that are entering the waterways from those sites. But we've also found them on railroads, which is the transportation, one of the transportation methods. We also find them at distribution points. So you go from the manufacturer, you go down the railroad, and they also do shipping and trucking and stuff like that. But if you go down the railroad to a place that's just going to offload all these pellets and then bag them up and then distribute them, through ship or rail or truck, we also find them there. And so it is a problem throughout the entire supply chain for these plastic pellets, and they are not considered hazardous material. And so there's an issue with how they're handled. What are the impacts? In 1992, the Environmental Protection Agency came out with a report called Plastic Pellets in the Aquatic Environment, Sources and Recommendations. And so you can Google that, and it's you can get a PDF off the internet. But in there, it compiles a bunch of research papers that were done in the late 80s and early 90s and talks about what the impacts are to wildlife. And not only birds. At the time, they knew there was about 80 species of birds that were eating these things. Now we know that there are actually hundreds. The other bad thing about these is they absorb chemicals. And so you think about a sponge when it's out into the environment. This is a similar type thing to where these are floating around in the environment and they're absorbing harmful chemicals like PCBs, PAHs, DDT, all those things you don't want on your skin. You definitely don't want to put them in your mouth or anything. We don't want that for animals either. And so there's a lot of studies going on right now looking at the impacts of those. So say a fish, when a fish eats these, are those chemicals leaching out from the pellet and into the stomach lining of the fish and then into the muscle tissue? We don't have that answer yet, but with the technologies we have today and some of the research going on, hopefully we have those answers soon. So here's the Nurdle Patrol Citizen Science Project that I was talking to you about. It's actually, you go out to the beach, you search for 10 minutes, you count how many nurdles you find in that 10 minutes, and then you go to nurdlepatrol.org, you put your concentration in there, where you're at, and the date, and then it shows up on a map. And then the map has color-coded dots on there, and I'll show you some of those here in a second. But that allows us to try to figure out, where the sources of these pellets might be coming from. And you'll be pretty amazed when you look at some of these maps. So here's a map kind of zoomed out of the entire Gulf of Mexico. And on here, there's a legend that is color-coded. If you see a 0, or you see a green, that is 0 nurdles were found. Because remember, if you go out and you search and you find 0 nurdles, that's still data that we can use. And then as the colors get warmer, the concentrations get higher. And so once you're at purple, that's over 1,000 pellets in a 10-minute period. And that's a lot of pellets, and you'll actually see quite a few purples on this map. And I'll kind of zoom in here. But what I think is interesting about this is if you look over at Florida, they're almost all greens. There are a few yellows there, which are 1 to 30 pellets being found in a 10-minute period. But as you go further west in the Gulf of Mexico, the concentrations get higher and higher. Well, in Florida, there are very few plastic manufacturing facilities, and actually only around the Pensacola area. And then as you go west, the concentration of manufacturers gets it increases. And so you start seeing higher and higher concentrations. So let's take, for example, up in Galveston Bay, which this is, besides there being a spill, which last August there was a spill on the Mississippi River where they were getting 250,000 pellets in a 10-minute period. I mean, basically scooping them up thick on the shoreline. Besides that, if you took those out, the top 20 highest concentrations are in Texas, and the majority of them are in Galveston Bay. And that's also where the highest concentration of plastic manufacturing facilities are in the Gulf of Mexico. We have gone through and we wanted to make sure that the methodology was good in a way that communities can pick this document up and be able to go do the sample and know that they're doing it correctly, being able to use the information that comes out of this, so all the data in a way that can be used in future litigation or future research. And so this has been published in Marine Pollution Bulletin. And so y'all can, it's an open source, which means y'all can Google Nurdle Patrol methodology. This publication will come up. You can download it. You can share it. You can do whatever you want. You don't have to pay a fee to read it, which is the case with some scientific journals that come out. So the latest stats, we've had over 2,500 volunteers that have sent data into the Nurdle Patrol. Over 7,500 surveys have been conducted at over 3,300 sites around the U.S. And there are some outside the U.S., but for the most part, it's within the U.S. And then we've also signed up over 110 partner organizations that have incorporated Nurdle Patrol surveys into their existing program, or they've decided to start their own Nurdle Patrol project without any influence from Mission Aransas Reserve. It's their own project. With one caveat, they need to put their data into nurdlepatrol.org, right? And so we've created these kits that I'll talk to you about here in a second. So this is the top 20 highest concentrations of pellets. And so in the red box there is what I wanted to point out. And if you look at those high concentrations, that's at, the top one, 250,000 in 10 minutes. This was from the Mississippi River after a spill of a container opened up on the Mississippi River and just let out bags and bags of plastic pellets. And so all the green ones are Louisiana from that spill that are still being found even today. But if you take all those out, the rest are from Texas. So what's that tell us? Texas has a problem. There's problems all over the U.S., but Texas has a real problem. And so that's one of the things that we're using as justification that there needs to be change in policy at some of these factories. So there's something called the Texas Nurdle Bill. The Coastal Bend Surfrider Foundation developed a Nurdle Bill that is being put into the Texas legislative session hopefully by this week or next week. But there's a couple of key things in here. One is it's requesting that all permits for these facilities have zero plastic discharge in their permit, because currently it says they are allowed a trace amount of suspended solids. So it doesn't even mention plastic at all. And so that's a gray area. So if an inspector for the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality goes out and they see plastic pellets, there could be an argument from the company that that is a trace amount. And just to give you an example, during the Formosa Plastics lawsuit that Diane Wilson had, Formosa said that trace amount to them was 10,000 pellets per day per outfall. They have 12 outfalls. So a trace amount to them was 120,000 pellets per day is what they should be allowed. And so that's why we're putting the language in there of zero plastic pellets. Okay, so that Formosa lawsuit I just talked about, that was a $50 million settlement with Formosa agreeing to have that zero plastic pellet flakes and powders within their permit. And so they're working with TCEQ right now on that. But another thing is that Nurdle Patrol got $1 million of that funding. And so we're getting $200,000 per year for 5 years. So this is one of the things we're doing is we're hosting this event. Some of the other things I'll go through. Some of them are the billboards. So we just got billboards up this last month across Texas at key locations around underserved communities that are by plastic manufacturing sites. And so this is an effort to try to communicate to the community what these plastic pellets are, how they're getting into the environment, and what they can do about it. So another thing is we created these startup kits. So if you're part of an organization, and I know there's multiple organizations in here that have already received one of these kits, but they have in there everything that you would need to be able to start up your own Nurdle Patrol in your own community, no matter where you're at in the United States. And so there's 100 glass jars, there's field notebooks, tweezers. We also put in some, shirts and buffs since we're in the pandemic. So if y'all are interested in that, if your organization doesn't have one and you're committed to doing at least one survey per month, sending us your logo so we can put it on the website as a partner, then we will send you one of these kits. You can just send me an email. Another exciting thing is that we were able to create, we got a lot of interest from teachers. So teachers were like, we're not going to take our class out and do a survey, but man, we sure want to talk to them about how ocean currents work and how plastics get into the environment, what the problems are, and how the students can be able to try to make a change. And so we created a curriculum that school teachers can use to be able to teach just about those things. We also put in there 6 vials of nurdles so that there can be 6 different groups within a class of 25 that they can talk about how, plastics are entering the ocean, what some of those impacts are, and they have an example there. And then it talks about Nurdle Patrol, and if they have time when they're out at the beach or they're along a river shoreline, they can go out and they can do their own survey to try to help to make that change. And so we shipped our first box out last week. As of this week, 90 have been sent out, and we've got over 100 more that we're going to be sending out. So over 200 teachers. Think about that. 200 teachers, probably a minimum of 25 students per teacher. And so that's having a huge impact. And so we're really focused in our efforts on getting these. And actually, we have so many people that were wanting these that we had to create a Google form. So they can go to nurdlepatrol.org, they can go to news, and the first article there they can click on, and there'll be a Google form there. It talks about what's in the Nurdle Teacher Nurdle Kit, and then they can sign up with a Google form for that. So there's a number of different research projects that we have going on. The Matagorda Bay Mitigation Trust money that we're getting every year can only be used for education outreach. So if we want to do research, we need to write grants and try to get partnerships with other groups that are interested in that as well. And so we have been successful in working like with the Coastal Bend Bays and Estuaries program, who's up in the central Texas coast. And they funded a project looking at chemical absorption within 3 bay systems in Texas. So that's ongoing, and that project should wrap up actually at the end of August. Dr. Jean-Fei Liu is the PI for that, so he's the key person leading that. We've also got another one from 11th Hour Racing. They funded a project trying to fingerprint these nurdles to figure out where the source is. So if we had a source of pellets from, say, Formosa, since we were talking about Formosa, we could go and we could find a pellet at the beach and try to match that up with them. Because remember, the companies know that the pellet is theirs based on 2 things. So they know shape and size alone because of the extrusion process, and then also with the chemical recipe. And so both of those are proprietary information that only the company knows. And if we can figure out that, which actually the federal government ought to be the one to figure that out, but if we can figure that out, that's a huge step in the right direction. And then we've also just submitted a proposal to do the same thing we're doing here with the startup kits, the symposiums, networking throughout the country with different organizations that are interested. We submitted this to the NOAA Marine Debris Program to do the same thing down in Mexico. So we're working with a university down in Veracruz to try to do the exact same thing. So that's exciting. Hopefully we hear about that in the next month or so. So out of all this, why are we doing this? These are my kids, Jack and Parker. Why aren't they at the beach picking up seashells, playing in the water? Instead, I've got them out there picking up plastic pellets. Hopefully I'm not ruining their idea of what a nice beach day ought to be. But at the end of the day, they're too young to make decisions about this stuff. We know there's a problem now. From the data that's been collected with this, we can see that Texas is a big source of this problem. We can do something about it. So it's time to do something about it. And that's what we're doing and trying to change policy. So thank you all very much. We will now be able to take 3 minutes of questions. And we can start here live. If anybody here wants to get up and ask a question, we can do that. And then Sarah Cunningham is on the other line for anyone virtual. So is there anyone here that wants to ask a question? Come up to the microphone so that we'll be able to hear you.
Is there a reason that you picked 10 minutes as the time frame? Is that like a statistical reason for that on like numbers in a region, or is that just to keep the time low to encourage citizen scientists to collect them?
Great question, and it's a little bit of both. So one is to be able to standardize our data to where you can compare one site to another, you have to limit the parameters. And so you can collect more than 10 minutes, and we have a database that splits it up into 10-minute sampling time frames. The other was like, you can tell people it only takes 10 minutes, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's easy. When we first started Nurdle Patrol, people were going out and using dip nets. They were using shovels and sieves and buckets, and we soon realized within a couple of weeks that we have to say it can only be used, you can only pick up pellets with your hand only. That way you can compare one site to another. And so it's 10 minutes per person. And, you can put in, if a school group goes out of 25 people, it takes the total number and it divides that number by the number of people that we're sampling, plus it divides it by 10. Or if they sampled for 20 minutes, it would split it again by 10. And that gives you the number and the color of dot that's on that map. So it's all standardized. But we soon figured out that we were going to have to delete all that data the first 2 weeks that we started up in 2018, because that was not comparable. Luckily, it was only about 20 surveys that were done without using a hand. But since then, it's always done by hand.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Sarah, I'm not sure how this is going to work, but if Sarah has a question on there, feel free to bring that up.
Hey, Jace, we do have one question, but I'm trying to clarify it. I think there's a typo, but we'll try here. Last year during Christmas bird count on Bell property at Seadrift, we saw hundreds of nurdles in a retention, I'm assuming that's supposed to say retention pond on their property. Is this legal since it's on their property?
Yes. So they have retention ponds specifically, or plastic manufacturing company has retention ponds on their property specifically for holding back pellets. And then, of course, they have netting and ways of collecting those pellets before that water gets out into waters of the state. And so if it's in their property line, yes, that's legal. Okay, any other questions here? Okay, we have one more question here.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, if like the ocean currents, if the nurdles come through and get into the ocean currents, have we is the problem bigger than what we have, where some of these nurdles might have washed up to or out of the Gulf?
Great question, and the answer is yes. And so at Mission Aransas Reserve, we've done studies. Actually, Katie Swanson led some studies, and Caitlin Wessel, who's also going to be presenting later. They did studies around the Gulf of Mexico looking at marine debris accumulation in the Gulf of Mexico in a number of different states. And it was a 2-year project where they went out every month and cleared 100 meters of beach and brought all that trash back and put it into over 50 categories to figure out, what type of trash and what. And so it turns out that in the Texas coastal bend, we have 10 times the amount of trash coming up on our shorelines than any other state in the Gulf of Mexico. And that is mainly due because of the ocean currents. So there's a loop current that comes around the Yucatan Peninsula and then gets up into the Gulf Stream. But when that loop current comes around, it creates these eddies that push ocean trash or anything that's in those currents up on our shoreline. Yes, and so that's very good, because when Nurdle Patrol first started up, we contacted the state agency, and they thought, well, all these nurdles we're finding on the beach from a spill, there in Corpus Christi, that was probably from offshore another country because of the way the currents work. But because we've had, over 2 years of data collected now, we're seeing the highest concentrations up in the bay systems where the highest concentration of plastic manufacturing companies are. So that tells us, yeah, there are some probably coming from, other countries or spills offshore or something. But whenever you have the highest concentrations up in the bay systems where the highest concentration of manufacturers are, that's most likely where the problem is coming from. So great question. Okay, let's see if Sarah has one other question on there. And then we have another one here live.
Here's a good one, Jace. If we want to ask our state representative or senator to sponsor the Nurdle Bill, is there information that we can send them?
Yes, and so that Nurdle Bill, the last day to file is March 12th. So the bill will be filed before then. Once it comes out, there's probably going to be some media about that. And that will be a perfect opportunity for organizations. I believe the Texas Surfrider or the Coastal Bend Surfrider Foundation will likely be sending out, something that people can sign on to the bill and things like that to be able to support it. And so that would be a time for, if there wants to be some co-authors by some other representatives, that's a perfect time for that. Okay, we got time for one other question live.
The EPA does not consider nurdles as hazardous materials. I know the Nurdle Bill in California, will the Nurdle Bill in Texas give some impetus to force them into maybe considering that? When you look at the map of Texas that you showed us, it looks like we ought to have some political punch in trying to get that accomplished. Right,
yeah, you're exactly right. And that needs to be the goal. Getting not only at the state level changing policy, but ultimately at the federal level, getting these plastic pellets as being hazardous material would be key. Now the nurdles are likely inert whenever they're on their own, but it's once they reach the water and then they start absorbing the harmful chemicals, that's when they become very hazardous. And so that should be a good goal for everyone to strive for, is getting the EPA to say, hey, these are hazardous materials, and making new laws to be able to